Today's reading is from the book of Mark, chapter 5, and it can be found on page 816 in the Bibles in the seats in front of you. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. They began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Thank you. Morning, Refuge Church. My name is Gary, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to preach for you this morning. I'm just going to move my communion over here, Sadie. Don't let me forget it. Two confessions, though, before I start. One, back in June of this year, I had jaw surgery, and they actually removed both my upper and lower jaws and put it back in a better place. And the work of that is intense, and I'm still recovering, and I can't actually feel my lower lip. And every time I take a drink, it feels like I'm drooling. So if I seem a little OCD about like what's going on, it's because it feels like I'm drooling, and I may or may not be actually drooling. I don't know. And then secondly, my wife, Kira, who some of you may have met, we've been attending Refuge since February or March of this spring. She's a professor at UNM. On my way out this morning, she asked me how I felt about the sermon that I had prepared, and I said, I think it's pretty good. It's like a B minus. And she's like, "Oh, honey." So I thought B minus was a decent grade. My professor wife doesn't seem to agree with me, and my only hope is that Jesus can take B minus and make it worth your while. So let's trust that work to the Holy Spirit. If you've been at Refuge over the course of the last few months, you'll know that we've been in a series from the Gospel according to Mark. And it's worth asking at this point, now that it's been a couple months into it, do you remember what Mark is actually trying to do in this Gospel? From the opening sentences of chapter 1, Mark says that he wants to announce a gospel, and that what he's writing is good news. It's this announcement that has both personal and political implications for those who hear it. He says, "I've got good news for you about this person that I met named Jesus of Nazareth, who is in fact the Son of God, who is in fact bringing a new kingdom to earth. And this kingdom is characterized, Mark will argue, by forgiveness, by restoration, and by the palpable presence of God, to use Ryan Bestelmeyer's phrase from the first week of this series. But as Mark tells this story, he's doing something different than the other gospel writers that you might find in the New Testament. Matthew, for instance, is writing like a historian might write. As he tells the story of Jesus, he is constantly pointing back to the words of ancient Jewish prophets to tell you how their words find their fulfillment in the life of Jesus. So he's writing like a historian. Luke, on the other hand, admits from the very beginning that he is just listening to the eyewitnesses tell their story, and he wants to compile them into a narrative so that you might have certainty about what the things he's going to tell you about Jesus. He writes like a journalist. And then John, who is my favorite, John was with Jesus in a way that even another disciple like Matthew wasn't. And John, as you read his gospel, he writes with kind of a beauty, with a poignancy, with a sort of a theological wooing. He wants to reach your heart more than your mind. And so he presents more of Jesus' teaching and self-descriptions than anyone else. He writes like a friend who is also a poet. So if you've been here over the last couple months, how would you characterize Mark? What is it that Mark is doing that's different from these other writers? And it's difficult maybe because we break up the story into small bits. We don't always put our arms around the entirety of it every time we come together. But let me ask you this. Do you know the name Nick Cave? Anyone? Nick Cave? Not Nick Cage, the superhero, but Nick Cave, the Australian singer, songwriter, sometimes author. If you've ever seen an episode of Peaky Blinders, his is the voice that sings that opening theme song, Red Right Hand, which is just as bloody as that sounds. And no, for the record, this is not an endorsement of either Nick Cave or Peaky Blinders. I'm just putting these things on the cultural map for you. But Cave's music, if you do explore it, is often dark and kind of emotionally intense. And it's not Christian, not really. But it's kind of Christ-haunted. He uses images and themes from Scripture frequently in his writing. Oddly, in the late 90s, Nick Cave was approached by a publishing house to write an introduction to a standalone Gospel of Mark that they were going to print. Cave had been raised in the Australian Anglican Church, which he called the decaf of worship. I don't know what that means, other than it's probably unsatisfying to some degree, but I thought it was a good line, so I wanted to use it. But in his own telling, in his being raised in that church, he finally bought a Bible for himself in his early 20s, and he said that he was drawn to the violence of the Old Testament, to the God that would punish wickedness, because that violence resonated with his own anger so much, because he was also upset about what was wrong in the world. In his own telling, it becomes something of an unhealthy obsession, this angry, violent God that he saw in the Old Testament. And so at his priest's recommendation, he turned his attention to the New Testament, and the priest said, start with Mark, and he said, why? He goes, because it's short. And Cave said that the gospel according to Mark just swept me up. And here's a quote from his introduction. He said that Mark took from the mouths of teachers and prophets the jumble of events that comprised Christ's life and fixed these events into some kind of biographical form. And he did this with such breathless insistence, such compulsive narrative intensity, that one is reminded of a child recounting some amazing tale, piling fact upon fact as if the whole world depended on it, which of course to Mark it did. So Nick Cave, with the eyes and the ears of an artist, of a rock star, is picking up on something in Mark, that sense of drama that scholars also point to. Gary Burge, who's a New Testament scholar, says that Mark's story of Jesus is known for being quick-paced and dramatic, and in fact, its story is so compelling when read aloud in the Greek, and it reflects so many features of Greek theater that many scholars are convinced that this gospel was originally intended for oral presentation, to listen to it out loud. Mark is essentially not like a historian or a journalist or a poet friend, but like a screenwriter, like a dramatist. He wants you to see what's happening in the pages of his gospel, to see in your mind's eye this Jesus walking the earth like Mark is testifying he did, and for you to consume it not just as entertainment, but to begin asking questions, what is this that I'm seeing? And in fact, Mark, in the telling of the first half of his gospel, presents people constantly asking questions about Jesus. What does this thing that Jesus did mean? Who is this Jesus? Who was this Jesus? So this morning, as we enter into chapter 5 of Mark's gospel, I want to look with you at three aspects of a story that we actually began last week. The story bridges chapter 4 into chapter 5, and so if you missed last week, you can find that sermon from David online on the Refuge website. But at the end of chapter 4, Jesus has just told his disciples, look, I want to go to the other side of the sea. And so last week we looked at what happened on the way across the sea to this other side. And the text today tells us what happened when they arrived. And my friends, the drama is immediate. It opens up with this experience of a unique kind of evil in verses 1 through 5. A unique evil. If you are ever in a horror movie for yourself, if you're a character in a horror movie, there are just certain things that we all know by now you should not do. Like, don't go in the basement. Don't go by yourself to find out why the power just went out. Don't be the person who walks away saying, I'll be right back. And depending on your franchise, maybe don't sleep, don't answer the phone, various things. But when we're watching these movies and we see characters doing these things, our heart rate increases. We feel tension on their behalf because we know what's coming for them. There are moments like that in Mark's gospel, but we don't feel them. It makes me remember that what we're looking at is a foreign document. It's a foreign text, an ancient text, a story that has to be translated not just across language but across culture, and we have to work to understand the tension. So when chapter 5 opens up, you need to know that Mark stacks in rapid succession 4 details that would have raised the heart rate of his audience. It would have raised tension in their very body. And the tension is not a physical fear for the life of Jesus, it is a religious fear because this Jewish rabbi's ritual purity was about to be stained probably forever. Look again at the first 2 verses of Mark 5 with me. We can put it up on the screen for you. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes, and when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Look, if you were an observant Jew, you could hardly design a less desirable or more repulsive situation than Jesus is walking into willingly. And so this tension that these Jewish listeners are feeling, however you name it, if it was a fear of spiritual danger or a fear of some kind of cultural contamination, or if it was just disgust that Jesus would do this, they begin to feel that tension right when he starts crossing the sea. And so the sense of danger was set by the storm that nearly killed them on the way, but now we find out what was waiting for them, and these 4 things stack up. The other side of the sea. This is cluing the reader into knowing that this is actually pagan Gentile territory, and the geography itself is hazardous. It is rough and rocky and craggy, far less welcoming and far less enjoyable than the beaches on the Galilean side. And yet Jesus goes to the other side of the sea, 1, 2, to the country of the Gerasenes. At this point, if you have a text in front of you, there's a footnote that points you to the bottom, and it seems like there's some textual confusion here, because Matthew and Luke say this was the country of the Gadarenes, Mark says Gerasenes, and still other older translations say Gergesenes. Is this a contradiction? Scholars don't believe so. They believe simply, I don't want to get hung up on this, but these things kind of fit together like nesting dolls. Like if you were one of the Gergesenes, that refers to the small village on the coast. The Gerasenes is the surrounding area, kind of like a county, and the Gadarenes lived in what you would say is like the state. So it's like saying Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, or New Mexico. Either way, whatever the point of reference is, the Jewish reader would have heard, oh, he's going to where the pagans live. They would get the reference no matter how you name it. He's going to this Gentile pagan people. And to make it worse, when he arrives, he steps out of the boat. And where is he? He's right by a cemetery. And out of the immediate area, a man comes to him out of the tombs. There is no worse place for a person to come to a Jewish rabbi than out of the tombs. Touching a corpse, being near a corpse, was the worst kind of ritual uncleanness you could find. And then just to make it a little bit worse, this man who comes out of the tombs, the text says, had an unclean spirit because, frankly, of course he did. Of course, going to the other side of the sea, landing in a pagan land where pagans lived and did pagan things, and then buried their pagan dead. Of course, the first person that Jesus is going to encounter is a naked, crazy man possessed by an unclean spirit. And if you don't think it gets any worse, it does, because if you keep reading through the text, you get to verse 11, and you can consider this kind of a first century oral theater Jewish jump scare, because the text says, now a great herd of, and you can almost feel the Jewish reader going, no, pigs was feeding nearby. This is that Indiana Jones moment in the first century, pigs. Why did it have to be pigs? And there were no memes in the 800s BC, but there was a prophet named Isaiah, and in his writing to the people of Israel, he held up the epitome of an unclean person, talking about how God wanted to have mercy on that person. Here's the epitome of what it means to be unclean: people who live in tombs and eat pork and say to God, don't come near me. This is the utmost uncleanness. And look, there are other moments in Mark's gospel where a person with unclean spirits encounters Jesus. For instance, in chapter 1, Jesus walks into a synagogue, and there was a man there that apparently just kind of blended in with the worship that was happening. But when Jesus walks in, the demon makes himself known. Otherwise, he was blending in with the community. But this man doesn't blend in. This is a unique encounter with someone in the grip of evil. He is wild and unwashed. He is naked. He is living among the dead. He seems to have some kind of terrifying Hulk-like superhuman strength that was increasing. Look at verse 3. No one could bind him anymore, which implies that once upon a time they could. But he could not now be chained or subdued. And if you heard him howling. You heard him crying. And if you saw him, you might see him cutting himself with stones. This is a desperate, terrifying, horrifying encounter. And as Jesus begins to talk to this man, we learn through that conversation that he has not just one unclean spirit in him, but apparently many, a multitude, some thousands. He calls himself legion, and a Roman legion was 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers. How does this hit your modern mind? I mean, could this possibly be the truth about what was happening in this person? We know historically, in the first century, anything that caused a person to lose control of their body was called an unclean spirit. So if somebody had a mental condition like schizophrenia or a dissociative mental illness, they were said to have an evil spirit, along with things like epilepsy and other seizure-inducing conditions, among other things. So maybe this is just a primitive way of trying to say that this man was sick beyond all help, that this was a situation beyond their understanding. And maybe that's a fair question to ask, but in this instance, I think we have to trust the text that this is not merely an illness because, for one, the man sees Jesus from a distance. And he recognizes who Jesus is. And this is where it gets a little weird, because he recognizes him not just as a human being, that he's a rabbi named Jesus, but he sees in Jesus his divine identity. He refers to him in verse 7 as the Son of the Most High God. He speaks to Jesus with a mysterious sense of recognition, like they've seen each other before. It's weird. And then equally weird, equally mysterious, and maybe even a little spooky, and I won't pretend to understand it, in the rest of verse 7, that the demon begs Jesus not to torment him. And in Mark's gospel, it's kind of just a straightforward, hey, I recognize the power in you, don't torment me. But in Matthew's telling of the same story, the demon adds the phrase, don't torment me before the time. What does that mean? It's as if this demon has some knowledge of a coming judgment, and he's begging for mercy from the one who will be the judge someday in the future. So not just a simple illness. This is a conversation with a being who has some kind of intelligence possessing this man. So Jesus has made his way across the sea and is now here, face to face with a man possessed with a legion of demons. Or maybe more accurately, as the story unfolds, we'll see the truth of this is now that this legion of demons is suddenly face to face with Jesus. So as this story, this drama is unfolding in our mind's eye, we have to ask the question, what will this one Jesus do against these many demons? And so in the face of this evil, we see Jesus, this is the second point, exercise a unique authority. An authority the church has spoken and preached in time for generations simply by saying that Jesus is Lord. From the beginning of the gospel, Mark's been telling us stories that demonstrate the unique authority of this one Jesus, and we're growing in our understanding of what kind of authority is embodied in this Jesus, but what we're about to see is still unexpected. Have you ever been surprised by somebody who had an unexpected kind of authority? When my wife was in grad school, I was working for Bank of America, and a man came into our branch, and he had well-kept gray hair, a long gray beard. He was wearing glasses that made him look intelligent, and he was also wearing a black shirt with a clerical collar. He had a situation to resolve with his credit card. It's not something we could do in the branch, so my job in that moment is to bring him into my office, get him on the phone with the people that work with credit cards, and let them fix it. But in the meantime, every time you call the credit card company, just like you do at home, you're put on hold. And so you have to wait. And we have to make small talk. And so with this dignified man across my desk, I said to him, "Sir, I see that you're wearing a clerical collar. Is there a particular way that I should address you when I introduce you to the people on the phone?" And he was looking down at his statement, and he didn't even raise his head. He raised his eyes over the top of his glasses, and he said, "You want to call me by my title?" And I said, "I do." He goes, "You may call me Your Eminence." I wasn't expecting that. I thought Father, some normal priestly kind of title. And as it turns out, this man wasn't, as I thought, a priest in the Catholic tradition. He was a bishop, the equivalent of a bishop in the Orthodox Church over all of Spain and Portugal. And in his tradition, he was treated with great respect and referred to, in fact, as Your Eminence, although I learned later that his friends just called him Bishop Epi, which is kind of sweet and tender. But once I learned his authority, I treated him with a different kind of respect. And as remarkable as we've seen Jesus so far in the Gospel of Mark, the scope of his power, the scope of his authority is still kind of being unfolded for us. We've seen him teach with authority. We've seen him claim to have the authority to forgive your sin, which is something only God can do. We've seen him heal almost every kind of sickness. We've seen him cast out unclean spirits one by one. And mysteriously, as last week's story ended, we saw him speak a word, and wind and wave went still and calm. And this Jesus now walks into this place and is met by a pagan man in the grip of a legion of evil spirits. Naked and wild, desperate and howling, just completely out of his mind, he comes running up to Jesus. He had been left alone to wander. He had been left alone to cut himself on the rocks until he killed himself because no one could bind him and no one could subdue him and no one could help him. And yet, just in the very presence of Jesus, the demon falls down and whimpers, begging for mercy. What is this Jesus? So if Mark is right, that in Jesus a new Lord has arrived announcing a new kingdom, then it makes sense that all existing, occupying rebel powers must be displaced. They must be defeated. And this moment points to the end of time when the scripture says every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. All of us. But Jesus is about to reclaim this man for his own kingdom, restoring him to full health, restoring him to his right mind. And he does it not by force, not by violence, not by chains, just with his word. Look at verses 10 through 13 with me. And he, that is, this man filled with demons, begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." And so he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out, entered the pigs. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. With just this word of permission, this man was delivered of the demons. The demons fled into these pigs, and for some reason caused the pigs to run into the sea and be drowned. With just a word, what kind of unique authority does this Jesus have? And while we're at this moment, can we ask the question that you're now thinking? What about the pigs? This doesn't seem fair to these pigs. If you've ever seen a herd of pigs, when we lived in Ithaca, I once went to a farm, and there was a herd of pigs that were just running around this field, and it was kind of delightful, and I loved it. And my family has had affection for pigs ever since we read Charlotte's Web. So what about the pigs? I've been troubled by this, honestly. Like this action, it would have been a devastating blow to the surrounding economy. Scholars think in our time, this is something equivalent to a $250,000 loss. That's where the estimates begin, by the way. This would have been a devastating blow to the livelihood of people that God says he cares about. And if God cares for birds and flowers, doesn't he also care for pigs and pig farmers? Not to mention, and maybe this is the parent in me, but not to mention the sheer mess of it all. 2,000 drowned pigs floating under the Middle Eastern sun. That situation was going to get worse before it got better. Whose job is it to clean up after Jesus? Honestly, it bothered me. But there's this interesting comparison in the text that, as I sat with this story, rebuked me this week. Look at this comparison. This is verses 14 and 15. The herdsmen fled and told in the city and in the country what happened. And the people came to see what it was that had happened. And the people came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Compare that to the last verse of this story, verse 20, where it says that the man went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Do you see it? Did you hear what the comparison is there? Look at these two passages side by side. Those who listened first to the herdsmen, even though they saw for themselves the man clothed and in his right mind, they were afraid. But those who first listened to the man tell his own story, they ended up marveling, amazed, and left in the Greek in a state of wonder. That's fascinating to me. It's the same story, but it's being told from two different perspectives. Like for the farmers, this was a war story. There were two powers, neither of which they could control, that came into their country, and they fought over the life of a man. And this herd of nearby pigs was just collateral damage. They were casualties of war. But who knows what else this man is going to do if we let him stay, so they begged him to leave. But for the man, it was a story of liberation. It was a story of God's mercy. It was the story of a power that he did not know even existed, that crossed a sea and expelled his demons and set him free and saved his life. And who knows what else this man will do. So let me stay. Let me stay with him. And he begged Jesus to let him stay. Are you left looking at the pigs or looking at the man? It changes how you perceive what happened. The man leaves with this story of experiencing the unique mercy of Jesus. That's the end of this story, this unique mercy. Look with me at the very end, I'm going to include verse 21, verses 18 through 21. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And Jesus did not permit him, but he said, "Go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And so the man went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. And then here's how the next paragraph starts. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. I just want to note two things here. One, verse 19 is so beautiful. It's so tender. It's so lovely. Go home to your friends. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. What a tender, simple, life-giving expression of mission. Sure, others in the church, others who follow Jesus would be asked to go far away and to talk to foreign people, to talk to strangers. But this man was told to go home and talk to his friends about what God had done, about God's mercy to him. His job was to go home and make Jesus famous. That's a good job. And so, if you can answer the question for yourself, what has the Lord done for you? How has the Lord shown mercy to you? If you can answer that question, you too can pick up that piece of mission and tell your friends how much the Lord has done for you. Secondly, did you hear how the next story picks up? Like, there's this dramatic encounter, and then Jesus just crosses the sea back to where he had left the crowds to begin with. This is astounding. I mean, do you see what just happened? Jesus once said that if a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, I get emotional and then I lose control of my voice, and I might be drooling. Does not that one leave the crowd of 99 and go in search of the one? More than just a parable. This story, this drama, this movie in our minds shows us who God is. Because it seems that the entire reason that Jesus crossed the sea, leaving the crowds on one side, was for this one man, to set him free. And how unlikely is this one, a forgotten, hopelessly oppressed man, learns that he's neither forgotten nor hopeless, because Jesus found him. And Jesus set him free. This is the Jesus we come to worship in this space every week. He is our Lord. He is our champion. He is our Savior. I see him do this act, and my heart leaps toward him. I want to just say two more short things before we celebrate communion together. One, this God that we know that would leave the 99 and go after the one, that would leave the crowd and go after this man, this is your God. He knows you. He sees you. You're not a stranger to him, even if you feel far from him. He knows your name. You're not hidden from him. The Jesus who crossed the sea to find a man wandering in the cemetery is the Jesus willing to cross heaven and earth, time and space even, to come to you here, now, in this place, in this moment. And he wants to make himself known to you. His Spirit is here, not just in some collective sense, but with you, individually, personally, asking for your attention. And secondly, the good news is that his heart is to do for you and keep doing for you just what he did for this man. He wants you to be free. Now listen, you don't actually need to be possessed by demons to know the effects of evil, the presence of evil, the consequences of evil in your own life, do you? We know the character of evil that's personified in those demons, but we live it. It's the water in which we often swim. We feel it in our own person. And so some of you might look at this man and you see this evil in an extreme form and you feel like, that's just nothing like me. But I know others of you see him, and in your heart you're saying, I actually do know something of that. Some of you know what it is to live in isolation, to feel lonely, not just from other people, but from God. Some of you know what it is to live with a sense of despair, to feel like you are hopeless, that there's no one that can help you, no one that can let your life change. Some of you have cut yourselves. Some of you have contemplated suicide. Some of you feel that if we really knew who you were, we would run. We would be afraid of you, and so you find ways of hiding who you really are. This is the presence of evil, the effects of evil in us, in the world. Evil does what evil always does. It breaks and harms and isolates and enchains and enslaves you in patterns of living that keep you from being who God made you to be. So when we see Jesus with a word, set this man free, does not your heart also long to be in the presence of Jesus and to let him lead you into greater and greater freedom? Will you take a moment of quiet? I would encourage you, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes, to lose the visual distractions, to stop and reflect and receive what has happened in this story for yourself. Jesus is here. His Spirit is here for you and with you. And as you come into his presence, is there something that you know binds you, that you are powerless to get rid of? Will you ask Jesus then to free you, to heal you? And know this, he might answer that prayer in a moment like an exorcism, but likely he will work in your life over a season, asking you to exercise faith daily, coming to him, letting his Spirit tend you, like a farmer that works her fields or like a shepherd caring for sheep. His Spirit will work patiently, skillfully, tenderly, constantly. And the one who begins that good work in you will be faithful to complete it. So take a moment and ask of him what you will.